Let me begin with a brief story about my family. My ancestors on my mother's side of the family were part of a small little group called the Wendish, a small Germanic sect among the many that populated the valleys of the Germanic countries. They had their own language, which is now a dead language. And they were die-hard Lutherans. Lutherans surrounded by Catholics that persecuted them in the endless religious wars that waged for centuries in Middle Europe. My ancestors told stories about seeing their relatives hanged from porches, an early model of lynching. Finally, in the mid-18th century, they had had enough and decided to emigrate to new frontiers. They were one large Lutheran congregation, but they were too large to fit into one ship, and so half of them sailed to Australia and half of them sailed to Texas to take up land grants, free land grants. Land, of course, that was not our country's to give, having been stolen from the Native Americans, but I doubt that ever entered my ancestors' consciousness. They settled in central Texas in a little town called Giddings that already had a German Lutheran church and a settlement, and you would think that that would make them feel comfortable and welcome among their own people. But no, they were the wrong kind of Lutherans, and they were the wrong kind of Germans. So they built their own Lutheran church directly across the street from the existing Lutheran church. And to this day, the two congregations rarely mix. I tell this story to show that there's something deeply human that seems often to happen when people flee persecution. If they're lucky enough to find some place where they can feel free, sometimes they create a bubble around themselves where they feel like they can be safe among their own kind. And decades, indeed centuries later, most of my relatives still live in that little bubble in central Texas, worshiping in the same Lutheran church. Few of them looking up to see the suffering that surrounds them. I thought about this a lot when I was in Israel with our UUCA delegation, as I saw how meaningful and how important and how liberating it was for the Jewish people after centuries of persecution to find a land and homes where they could feel free and safe. And I saw how some of them, like my family, created a bubble around them in which they only wish to be with their own kind and have no opening or ability to see the suffering of others. I understand that. Again, there's something deeply human in response to trauma, even in generation after generation removed from the trauma. I understand it. And yet we hope for something different. I wanted to go to Israel and Palestine to try to witness and understand just this, what traumatized people do to traumatized people. This dynamic acts out in its purest forms there, in what many see as the most intractable conflict that exists in the world. I wanted to see what I could learn about conflict. I wanted to try to understand the relationship of religion to that conflict. As Thoreau said, the question is not what you look at, but what you see. I wanted to try to see. – And I confess I went with some ambivalence. Because we have conflicts of our own in this country, conflicts which demand our attention and our action and our compassion. Did I need to fly halfway around the world to see others? This congregation has many causes that we already struggle to support. Did we need to add one more to a long list? And on a deeper level, I had to ask myself whether I was willing to walk that tightrope of how to talk about Israel honestly without immediately being branded an anti-Semite, which is all too likely a possibility. I went despite this ambivalence, inspired in part by those in this congregation who have been dedicated for years to understanding the Middle East crisis. I went, and I am eternally grateful to those who spurred me on, as it was one of the most profound experiences of my life. The reflections in this sermon will hardly do it justice, as there's certainly more for me to process and reflect upon. And my reflections are not the only ones you can hear, as the entire group of the 23 of us that went from this church will be ready and willing to share their experiences with you. And there are some among you now. Those of you who went on the trip with me, would you rise and stand? Thank you. It was an honor to be with you. So let me be clear at the outset. I do not blame the Jewish people for the conflicts in Israel. I do not hold the religion of Judaism responsible for the infliction of pain. I do not blame the Muslim people. I do not hold the religion of Islam responsible for terrorism. Just as with Christianity and indeed every world religion, there are people who will bend and distort and pervert the noble sentiments of their religion to justify their oppression and dehumanization of others. I also don't want to paint a wide brush of assuming that people within each group are the same. There are brutal Israeli soldiers, and there are kind Israeli soldiers who reflect deeply upon what they are asked to do. There are brave and nonviolent Palestinian freedom fighters, and there are Palestinians who have done horrifically violent things to innocent people. There are Jewish Israelis who abhor what is happening in their name. And there are complacent and fearful Palestinians who will do only what is necessary to live their lives. Just as here and everywhere the systems of injustice are complicated and intertwined with greed and corruption and obliviousness and fear, I could not possibly in the course of this sermon untangle all of this for you, nor do I wish to. What I would like to do is simply give you some glimpses of what we experienced and what we witnessed. And as I begin to do so, I can hear the echo in my head of the demand of one of the activists who spoke with us, Bassem Tamimi, who said over and over again, "Do not come here to feel sorry for us. We do not need your pity. We don't even need your support. We do not need you to save us. We need you to understand the nature of injustice. We need you to see that we are all a part of the same system which keeps all of us from being free." Bassem Tamimi lives in a tiny village called Nabi Salah in the West Bank outside of Ramallah, where his family has resided for over 400 years. He says proudly that some of his ancestors are Jewish. Everyone in his small village shares the same name because they are all related in some way. Their town grew up around a small, precious spring because sources of water in the desert are the primary source of life. But decades ago, the occupation came and took over the spring and diverted it for the use of a settlement that was built on the next hill over from the town. This settlement has already taken over 40% of the Tamimi's land and continues to try to force more and more of them off. As we visited in Bassem's house, there was a bulldozer strategically placed just yards from his front door to make a point. In 2009, Bassem organized a simple protest. He and his family and any who wished to join them would simply march down to the spring. The spring which had been the source of life for their family for centuries, and they didn't do it to provoke a fight. They simply wanted to show that they had the right to be there, to simply be present. They were met with armed settlers and then Israeli soldiers who lobbed stones, tear gas, shot rubber bullets, and sometimes live rounds into a small group of men and women and children. 25 of the villagers were injured. But they were not deterred. Every Friday, they continued to come. Every Friday since, they continue to come. Sometimes joined by international observers or advocates, often including Jewish activists, they continue to march every Friday to try to reach their spring, and they're never allowed to reach that far. Bassem has been held in jail over 12 times. He says he's lost track of how many times. For a total of 4 years of his adult life, almost none of those times was he formally charged with a crime, let alone convicted. He was once beaten so badly that his brain came loose in his skull, and he was in a coma for 10 days. When he came out of his coma, he learned that his sister had been killed by a mob of settlers because she was standing in front of the jail that had taken her 14-year-old son. And she was asking for his release, and she was beaten to death. His wife, Nariman, is every bit the activist that he is, also having been beaten and tortured and jailed. Nariman watched her brother die right in front of her from a round of live ammunition. Her brother had not been there to join the protest. Her brother came to visit his sister. And he heard a commotion outside, and he stepped out to try to help and was shot in the back in front of her. Bassem's home, just as every home in the village, has been invaded by soldiers hundreds of times. Every one of their 5 children have been gassed, shot with rubber bullets. And let me just say, a rubber bullet is a bullet just covered with rubber. Beaten, restrained, jailed. Bassem's youngest son is named Shalem, which means peace. And when he was young, Shalem declared he did not want to be called Shalem any longer because all he heard was that peace was impossible. Their daughter, Ahed, had a stun grenade tossed in her face when she was 11. And despite this, she's become one of the fiercest and most well-known faces of the resistance, having been filmed many times refusing to back down from soldiers, biting and kicking as she's been dragged away so many times, arrested and jailed, of course. And the Israeli government has accused the Tamimis of setting her up as an imposter because she happens to be blonde and green-eyed. And doesn't everyone know that Palestinians are dark? I could go on with their story, or you could read more about it in Ben Ehrenreich's incredible book, The Way to the Spring, Life and Death in Palestine. But despite all of this horror, the Tamimi house that we visited was full of joy and laughter. The children were just children playing video games and complaining about having to help set up for dinner. People from the village came in and out, always greeted with hugs and kisses, and greeting us, strangers and interlopers, with hospitality and open arms and hugs. And yet, of course, under the surface, there lurked the burning and ever-present trauma. How would you raise your children in this? Mamal Tamimi, another of the activists, asked us, how would you raise your children to believe that love is the most important thing when all they encounter day after day is hate? How would you teach your children love? And we all sat stunned in the face of this question. And yet again, they vociferously demanded that we not pity them. Mamal told the old story of someone coming across an elephant and his trainer. The trainer was leading the elephant by a simple rope that was tied only around one leg, and he asked the trainer, how do you do this? The elephant could easily snap that rope and run away. Why does he do what you ask? And the trainer said that, well, since he was just a little infant, we put that same rope around his leg, and when he was little, he couldn't snap it. And as he grew, the rope stayed, and he just kept assuming that he could not run. That, said Mamal, is how all of us are. We all have ropes around us that hold us in place in our willing submission to structures that oppress us, even when we're capable of throwing them off. What are your ropes? He demanded of us. Attend to your ropes, and we will attend to ours, and together, someday, we may be free. I could tell you so many other stories beyond just those of the Tamimi family that we encountered, all of them illustrating some common themes. That resistance equals life. Even when resistance brings physical death. Because resistance is the only choice that leaves one with self-respect. Every one of the freedom fighters that we met were clear they did not blame Judaism. They blamed an oppressive government. They fight for their land because it is the only land they have ever known, even if it is only a few square yards of dirt. They fight because they don't want to join the millions of refugees who have been forced away decade after decade to live in degradation in strange lands. The people that we grew to know, the stories that we heard, the injustices and oppression witnessed firsthand will live in my heart forever. And not just by virtue of the pain that it causes. As Ben Ehrenreich wrote, Palestine has a way of enchanting people. Perhaps it's the intoxicating proximity there of grief to joy and love to fury, the scale and the awful clarity of the injustice, and the people's resilience in the face of it. Many of us kept asking for signs of hope because clearly there are no easy answers to these conflicts, and everywhere we asked that, we heard the same answer. We hope because we have to. Because not to hope is to die. We heard this from the Jewish father whose 14-year-old daughter was killed in a suicide bombing. And rather than choosing to hate, this man took his grief and his pain and joined an organization of Jews and Palestinians united by their common grief of having suffered a grievous loss and still determined to find a way to peace. The people in that organization, Palestinian or Jewish, see themselves as one family, united in both grief and in peace. We visited a farm and a family that had been tenuously holding on to their land despite decades-long attempt to bulldoze them out, who boldly put a rock at their entrance that is painted with the slogan, "We refuse to be enemies." We refuse to be enemies. They've turned their oppression into a calling to commit themselves to environmental sustainability and invite people from all over the world to come to what they call the Tent of Nations. And I finally realized that in looking for signs of hope in them, we were looking for hope within ourselves. And I realized it was not up to them to give us hope. It is up to us to find it. It is up to us to fight for it, to build it in ourselves, in the world that surrounds us. Everywhere we went, we saw parallels to the injustices that exist right here in our communities. From the slaughter and displacement of Native Americans to the forced apartheid in which people of color still live simply because of the color of their skin, we recognize that none of us are innocent. As I said in the beginning, the terrorized turn around and terrorize others. The powerful seek to retain their power and privilege at all costs. High ideals are turned into righteousness, and the dehumanized learn how to dehumanize others. It is ever thus. And it is ever thus that oppressed people rise up and claim their humanity. Good people stand up to their own families and governments and demand change. People reach out across divisions and see humanity in each other's eyes. Again, from Ben Ehrenreich, I am optimistic because even in their despair with no reason to hope, people continue to resist. I cannot think of many other reasons to be proud of being human, but that one is enough. We met an extraordinary priest named Father Shakur, who, against all odds, built a school that welcomes Muslims and Christians and Jews, a rare feat in the West Bank. And he said to us, the land does not belong to the Israelis. The land does not belong to the Palestinians. The land belongs to God. And both the Jews and the Palestinians have to humble themselves before God and try to share their existence on the same land. A profound lesson to us all. We do not own our land. We are not owed anything. Our ultimate calling is to loosen our grip on the righteousness that we hold tight to and find a way to live together in peace. I am and will be forever grateful to the extraordinary people who shared their stories with us and who opened my eyes to what I have been blind to for so long. I pray for the courage to keep them open, to dare to see the injustice that exists all around us, and to act with only a modicum of the fearlessness that they show. How can I do otherwise when they offer us their shining example? Amen.